Senate Republicans are set to meet tomorrow to talk about a bill that would legalize online sports betting. The state constitution requires that any legal gambling be managed by the state's 11 tribes, which have endorsed the bill. The Sports Betting Alliance, which represents both FanDuel and DraftKings, has opposed the legislation, saying this isn't something voters want or need.
Voters aren't uniformly opposed to online sports wagering, but seemingly strongly oppose a deal that grants exclusive control to some tribal nations and limits competition and even bypasses direct voter approval.
Tribal leaders sharing their point of view during the 2026 State of the Tribes address back in February, saying the bill would benefit people locally.
By allowing a legal framework for mobile sports wagering through Wisconsin's tribes, the state will see increased revenue through the state gaming compacts, and consumers will have the legal protection needed to ensure they receive fair play.
The Wisconsin State Senate wraps up its session in March. If tomorrow's caucus goes to plan, the bipartisan bill could soon be up for a vote.